I was sitting in my corner office closing a multi-million-dollar deal when my own father called to uninvite me from what he called a simple family reunion. He said my single woman energy was too loud and ghetto for my brother's new wealthy white in-laws. I did not argue. I just smiled, hung up the phone, and posted a selfie from a private balcony in Aspen. Hours later, my entire family was panicking. I stood perfectly still looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown corner office. The sprawling skyline of Atlanta stretched out before me, a sea of gleaming glass and steel, catching the harsh midday sun. From up here, on the 40th floor, the cars below looked like tiny toys moving along a track, completely oblivious to the sudden shift in my reality. I had built a life that most people only ever see in magazines. I secured my position as a dominant force in the luxury hospitality industry through blood, sweat, and relentless ambition. Yet the voice on the other end of my cell phone possessed the unique power to drag me right back down to feeling like an unwanted, disappointed child. It was my father, Deacon Calvin. He had called my private direct line right in the middle of a heavily scheduled Tuesday. Whenever my father called me during business hours, it was never to ask how my day was going or to congratulate me on a recent corporate milestone. It was always to deliver an edict, a demand, or in this specific case, a brutal insult wrapped in the thin, deceptive guise of fatherly advice. The heavy silence on the line was thick with anticipation. I could hear the faint sound of a televised gospel choir playing in the background at his house, creating a bizarre and stark contrast to the absolute cruelty of the words he was preparing to hurl at me. He cleared his throat with that deep, authoritative rumble he usually reserved for standing behind the church pulpit on Sunday mornings. "It is just a reunion, Jada," he said. His tone was casually dismissive, treating the conversation as if he were discussing a change in the weather, rather than deliberately cutting me out of a major family event. And honestly, Ashley's family is coming. They are very refined. We do not want your loud single-woman energy making things ghetto. You would not fit the aesthetic. The word ghetto hung in the air between us like thick, choking smoke. It felt like a physical strike across my face. My own father, a black man who had raised me in a hard-working, middle-class household, was actively choosing to use a racially coded derogatory insult to diminish his own successful daughter. He was weaponizing that word specifically to protect the delicate sensibilities of my younger brother's new white fiancée and her allegedly wealthy family. I tightened my grip on my phone until my knuckles turned pale. I was wearing a bespoke tailored suit, sitting in an office suite that cost more per month than his yearly pension. Yet to him, my marital status rendered me a loud, embarrassing stereotype. I did not interrupt him. I let him keep talking silently, listening as he dug his grave deeper and deeper with every callous syllable. He went on to explain how incredibly important it was to make a flawless first impression. He rambled about how Ashley came from deep old money, how her parents expected a certain level of elite sophistication that I simply could not provide. According to his twisted logic, my presence, the presence of an independent, highly successful 35-year-old woman who spoke her mind, would somehow shatter the fragile illusion of perfection they were desperately trying to construct for these strangers. But I knew the real truth. I knew exactly what he was trying to hide behind his flimsy excuses. This trip was not just some casual last-minute family reunion in the snowy mountains. It was an ultra-exclusive, ridiculously expensive engagement party in Aspen for my younger brother, Jamal. Jamal was the undisputed golden child of our family. He was the firstborn son who had spent his entire adult life bouncing aimlessly from one failed startup to another, constantly funded and bailed out by my parents' slowly dwindling retirement savings. My brother could not even manage his own basic utility bills without crying to them for a monthly allowance. Yet in their blinded eyes, he was the absolute prince of the family, and Ashley was his newly acquired crown jewel. My mother, Brenda, treated Ashley like absolute royalty. She firmly believed that Jamal marrying into a supposedly rich, prominent white family would magically elevate our family's social standing among her competitive peers at their megachurch. My parents were perfectly willing to completely erase their own daughter from the picture just to ensure they looked flawless and acceptable for these people. They wanted a picture-perfect weekend in the snow, surrounded by unearned luxury, and they had collectively decided that I was a liability who might ruin their pristine performance. My name is Jada, and I am 35. If you have ever had your own family treat you like a liability, while worshiping a son who cannot even tie his shoes, without an allowance, hit that like button and subscribe. Stay tuned to hear exactly how I burned their high society facade to the ground. Standing there listening to his breathing on the line, I did not cry. A much younger, far more vulnerable version of me might have broken down and begged for an invitation. That younger version might have tried to desperately justify my worth, listing my endless accomplishments, reminding him of my financial success, or pleading to understand why my status as a single woman made me inherently unworthy of sitting at a dinner table with my own flesh and blood. But the woman standing in that corner office today was far past shedding tears over their rejection. I realized in that exact crystal clear moment that no amount of financial success, no level of professional grace, and no genuine effort on my part would ever be enough for people who were deeply committed to misunderstanding me. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool, filtered air conditioning of my office wash over my heated face. The sharp sting of his words began to harden into something entirely different. It hardened into a solid, unbreakable resolve. "You are absolutely right, Dad," I said, keeping my voice dangerously smooth and perfectly measured. "I would not fit the aesthetic at all. Have a wonderful trip." I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the end button before he could utter another self-righteous word. The silence that immediately filled my office was absolute and heavy. I walked slowly back to my massive mahogany desk and placed the phone face down on the polished glass surface. I did not scream in frustration. I did not throw my coffee mug against the wall. Instead, a cold, fiercely calculated smile spread across my face. My father truly thought he was protecting his precious golden son and his fragile new in-laws from my supposed embarrassment. He honestly believed he was boxing me out of their glorious high-status weekend in the mountains. He had absolutely no idea that he had just willingly handed me the match to light their entire fake kingdom on fire. They wanted to play high society games. They wanted to exclude the daughter who actually knew how the elite world operated. They were about to learn a devastating, unforgettable lesson about what happens when you try to lock the owner out of her own house. The war had officially begun and I was already holding all the winning cards. I grabbed my tailored blazer from the back of my chair and stepped out of my office. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind me, instantly sealing away the toxic energy of my father's phone call. I did not have the luxury of sitting around and wallowing in self-pity. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Alpine, an elite luxury hospitality and private wealth management firm. I built this empire entirely from the ground up, catering to the top 1% of global travelers, high net worth individuals, and international dignitaries. My days are dictated by boardroom negotiations, property acquisitions, and maintaining a flawless standard of absolute luxury. As I walked down the expansive sunlit corridor of my corporate headquarters, the rhythmic clicking of my heels echoed with authority. My chief financial officer, David, immediately fell into step beside me. He handed me a thick leather-bound portfolio containing the final vendor contract for our newest resort acquisition in the Swiss Alps. The deal was worth over $12 million and required my immediate authorization to finalize the transfer of assets. I did not even pause my stride. I scanned the executive summary, pulled my customized pen from my pocket, and signed my name on the dotted line. I handed the portfolio back to David with a firm nod, authorizing a massive international transaction without breaking a single sweat or missing a beat. This was my daily reality. This was the highly sophisticated, incredibly demanding life I had meticulously crafted, all while my family was busy convincing themselves that I was nothing more than an uncultured, loud embarrassment who would ruin their precious aesthetic. Before I could reach the private executive elevator, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently inside my blazer pocket. It was a relentless, rapid-fire buzzing that immediately signaled a barrage of incoming messages. I pulled the device out and saw the notification banner lighting up my screen. It was the family group chat. Normally, I kept this specific chat permanently on mute to protect my mental peace and maintain my sanity, but today, I needed to see exactly how they were spinning my supposed absence. I tapped the screen and opened the thread. The messages were rolling in one after another, creating a digital masterclass in passive-aggressive manipulation. Ashley, my brother's incredibly average, deeply entitled white fiancé, had taken the lead. She sent a text to the entire family that read, "So sad Jada cannot make it to the trip." But honestly, Aspen is super exclusive. She would probably be so bored without her regular loud crowd anyway. I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still by the elevator bank, staring at the glowing screen. The racial coding, the sheer audacity, and the blatant disrespect were blinding. Her regular loud crowd. It was a thinly veiled, deeply insulting dig at my friends, my culture, and my very existence as a successful Black woman. She was deliberately trying to paint me as some sort of unrefined neighborhood girl who would not know which fork to use at a fine dining restaurant, let alone how to conduct herself in a luxury ski resort. She was marking her territory, establishing her dominance over the family dynamic, and using my deliberate exclusion as a stepping stone to elevate her own fragile ego. Right on cue, Jamal responded to her message. My 32-year-old brother, a man who still actively asked our mother to pay his cellular bill and cover his car insurance, typed back with sickening enthusiasm. He wrote, "Exactly, babe. You always have such class and grace. You understand how these things work." The sycophantic behavior made my stomach turn. He then followed it up with a public service announcement directed at the rest of our family. He instructed everyone, including our aging parents, to make sure they packed their absolute best tailored winter wear. He emphasized that Ashley's parents were accustomed to a very high standard of living, completely fabricating a narrative about their immense wealth. He told our parents that our family needed to look the part, so we did not embarrass his future in-laws. He actually typed the phrase, "We need to elevate our presentation so they know we belong in their world." My mother, Brenda, immediately chimed in. Instead of defending her only daughter, instead of questioning why her future daughter-in-law was speaking about me with such blatant disrespect, she responded with a series of prayer hands and heart emojis. She sent a long text thanking Ashley for her profound understanding and her Christian grace. It was a sickening, infuriating display of subservience. My parents were bending over backward, contorting their own identities, and eagerly sacrificing their own daughter just to make a mediocre woman feel vastly superior. They were so desperate to be accepted by Ashley's supposedly prestigious old money family that they were willing to swallow any insult thrown my way. I read the text in absolute silence. I did not type a furious paragraph defending my character. I did not list my 2 Ivy League degrees or send them a screenshot of my 8-figure investment portfolio. I did not point out that I had spent the last 5 years traveling the globe, dining with actual billionaires, and mastering the exact kind of luxury lifestyle they were currently pretending to understand. Reacting emotionally was exactly what they wanted. They wanted me to be the angry, loud Black woman they had already decided I was. They wanted me to lash out so they could point their fingers and say, "Look, we were right to exclude her. She is unstable and disruptive." I refused to give them that satisfaction. Let them think they had won. Let them revel in their imaginary superiority. Let Jamal pump up his chest and pretend he was the wealthy patriarch providing this grand experience. Let Ashley believe her presence had magically elevated our family out of the gutter. I simply locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket as the elevator doors chimed and slid open. As the elevator descended to the ground floor, my thoughts drifted to the sheer hypocrisy of my mother's texts. Brenda was a woman who practically lived at our church, serving on every committee and judging everyone from the front pew. She preached endlessly about family unity and unconditional love, yet she was the first person to eagerly participate in my exclusion. For my entire life, she had placed Jamal on a golden pedestal simply because he was born a boy. It did not matter that he had dropped out of 2 different colleges. It did not matter that his various business ventures always ended in silent bankruptcies that my parents quietly paid off to protect his fragile pride. In their eyes, he was the heir to our family name, the prince who could do no wrong. And now he had brought home Ashley. Ashley was the ultimate prize in my parents' deeply flawed respectability politics. She represented proximity to a world my parents had only ever seen on television. They were so desperate to be adjacent to her perceived status that they willingly became accomplices in my humiliation. They allowed a woman who had known our family for barely a year to dictate who was worthy of attending a family gathering. They allowed her to label me as loud and ghetto without a single word of correction. The elevator doors glided open, revealing the expansive marble-floored lobby of the Apex Alpine building. The security guards immediately stood taller as I walked past. The front desk concierges offered warm, respectful greetings. "Good afternoon, Ms. Williams," they echoed as I swept through the grand entrance. I returned their greetings with genuine smiles. Here in the empire I had built with my own hands, I was not a disappointment. I was not an embarrassment. I was the absolute authority. I climbed into the back of my waiting town car, the plush leather seats a familiar comfort. As my driver navigated through the dense city traffic, my phone buzzed one more time. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was another message from Ashley in the group chat. "I hope you have a nice, quiet weekend at home, Jada. Maybe you can use the time to finally relax and recharge." The condescension was so thick it was almost tangible. She was practically patting me on the head, treating me like a petulant child who had been sent to her room while the adults went out to play. I stared at her text for a long, quiet moment. I did not block her. I did not leave the group chat. I wanted to keep the line of communication wide open. I needed a front row seat to their delusion so I could perfectly time their destruction. I typed a response, my thumbs flying across the digital keyboard with surgical precision. "Do not worry about me, Ashley," I replied. "I have a feeling this weekend is going to be incredibly entertaining for all of us. Have a safe flight." I hit send and locked the screen, tossing the phone onto the empty seat beside me. Let them interpret that however they wanted. Let them think I was backing down and accepting my place in the shadows. They were walking blindly into a world of wealth they could not even begin to fathom, completely oblivious to the fact that I held the master key to the very gates they were trying to lock me out of. The town car glided smoothly through the bustling Atlanta streets. I reached forward and tapped the glowing screen on the console to connect a secure call to my chief of staff, Trey. Trey was not just my absolute right hand in business. He had been my closest confidant and best friend since our undergraduate days at Spelman College. He knew the complex, high-stakes inner workings of my multi-million-dollar corporation just as intimately as he knew the deeply entrenched toxic dynamics of my family. The call connected instantly. Trey's voice came through the crisp audio system of the car, accompanied by the distinct rustling of heavy architectural blueprints. "I am reviewing the venue schematics for the Geneva property right now, Jada," he said, his tone all business. "The structural integrity of the West Wing needs your final approval before we can proceed with the renovation." "Approve the structural changes and double the budget for the heated marble flooring," I replied without a second of hesitation. "But right now I need you to pause the Swiss Alps deal and look at something far more structurally unsound. Check the family group chat." I could hear the rhythmic clicking of his keyboard come to an abrupt halt. A few seconds of heavy silence passed over the secure line. Then Trey let out a sharp, incredulous laugh that echoed through my car. "Ashley really just told you that you would not fit the aesthetic, and Jamal is actually backing her up. Jada, please tell me you are not going to let this blatant disrespect slide." "I am not letting anything slide, Trey," I said, leaning my head against the cool leather headrest. "I am simply giving them the shovels they need to dig their own graves. Your parents are actively co-signing this foolishness again." Trey sighed, the exasperation clear and heavy in his voice. "I will never understand how your mother can sit in the absolute front pew of Greater Grace Fellowship every single Sunday shouting amen and waving her expensive church fan, only to turn right around and treat her actual highly successful daughter like a second-class citizen." "Because it is not about religion, Trey," I said, my voice hardening as I stared out at the passing high-rises. It is about respectability politics. My mother operates under the delusion that our family's worth is entirely dictated by how we are perceived by polite society. To her, image is the only currency that matters. And in her twisted, deeply outdated hierarchy, Jamal is the ultimate investment. We both knew the harsh reality of my brother. Jamal was the golden child, the precious firstborn son, who had been coddled, shielded, and financially rescued from the real world since the day he was born. In my family, being a male heir was treated as an astonishing accomplishment in itself. It did not matter that Jamal was fundamentally incompetent. It did not matter that he had tanked 3 separate tech startups, all funded by my parents, draining their retirement savings accounts. To my mother and father, Jamal was the patriarch in training. They handed him the world on a silver platter, and he still managed to drop it. Yet they constantly rushed to sweep up the broken pieces so nobody in their social circle would notice his repeated failures. And now he has Ashley. Trey added, his tone dripping with thick sarcasm. The great white hope of the Williams family. Exactly, I said, feeling a familiar flare of anger ignite in my chest. Ashley is the ultimate prize for my mother. She comes from this supposedly prestigious old money family. My mother looks at Ashley and sees a direct golden ticket to high society. She treats that woman like absolute royalty. Brenda genuinely believes that having a wealthy white daughter-in-law validates our family, elevates our social standing, and proves to the entire congregation that we have finally made it to the top. It is pathetic, Trey said. Ashley treats your parents like they are the hired help, and they just smile, nod, and ask if she needs more iced tea. Because they are desperate, I replied. They are desperate for proximity to her whiteness and her perceived wealth. They are terrified that if they do not cater to her every single whim, she will realize Jamal is entirely broke and leave him. So they sacrifice me to appease her. They willingly throw their own daughter under the bus just to ensure Ashley feels comfortable and superior. Which brings us to the most ridiculous part of this whole circus. Trey said, the anger rising in his voice now. You are literally the chief executive officer of Apex Alpine. You build international resorts. You manage private wealth for dignitaries and moguls. You are a self-made multimillionaire. How do they still talk to you like you are a struggling intern fetching coffee? I let out a bitter, humorless laugh that caught in my throat. You know exactly why, Trey. Because I do not have a husband. In my parents' eyes, a woman's value is entirely dependent on the man standing next to her. It does not matter that I own a global hospitality empire. It does not matter that I employ hundreds of people and command boardrooms across 3 continents. Because there is no ring on my finger, my mother genuinely refers to my corporation as a little event planning gig. She literally tells her church friends that I just organize parties for a living to avoid explaining my massive corporate success. A little event planning gig. Trey repeated, thoroughly disgusted. We just closed a $12 million deal in Switzerland before lunch, and your mother thinks you are out here blowing up balloons and picking out matching napkins. That is exactly what she desperately wants to believe. I said, my gaze fixed on the tinted window. Acknowledging my actual power would completely disrupt their carefully crafted narrative. If they admit that I am wildly successful, they have to admit that Jamal is a colossal failure. If they admit that I am entirely self-sufficient, they have to admit that my independence is valid. And my father simply cannot handle a woman who does not need him or any man to validate her existence. So they diminish me. They call me loud. They call me ghetto. They reduce my corporate empire to a hobby so they can feel perfectly comfortable worshiping a son who still relies on them for gas money. Well, Trey said, the sound of paper shuffling returning to the background of the call. They are about to have a very harsh reality check in Aspen. Do you want me to cancel their reservations and end this right now? No, I said softly, feeling that cold, calculated smile return to my face. Do not touch a single thing on their itinerary. I want them to experience the absolute pinnacle of luxury. I want them to get so comfortable in their borrowed high society aesthetic that they completely forget how they got there in the first place. Let them bask in the glory of Ashley's old money facade for a little while longer. I ended the call with Trey, the click of the disconnect echoing in the quiet cabin of the car. I instructed my driver to head toward my private residence, ready to watch my family construct a beautiful house of cards right before I kicked the table out from underneath them. The very next morning, I was standing at the head of the massive polished oak table in the executive boardroom of Apex Alpine. We were in the middle of our third quarter global strategy review. I had my chief financial officer and 12 of my top regional directors hanging on to my every word as we broke down the revenue projections for our properties in the Swiss Alps and the French Riviera. The energy in the room was electric, sharply focused, and completely under my command. I was in my element, pointing to the digital projection screen and outlining our acquisition strategy when the private cell phone resting face down on the table began to vibrate. It was a harsh, persistent buzzing that cut right through the quiet professionalism of the boardroom. Only 3 people in the entire world possessed the direct number to that specific phone. My chief of staff, Trey, my head of operations, DeAndre, and my parents. And my parents were strictly instructed to only ever use that number in the event of a literal life or death emergency. I held up a single finger to pause the presentation. My directors immediately fell silent. I picked up the phone expecting to hear that someone had been rushed to the emergency room or that a major accident had occurred. I stepped out of the heavy glass doors of the boardroom and into the quiet, carpeted executive hallway before pressing the phone to my ear. "Is someone in the hospital?" I asked, my voice tight with genuine concern. "No, Jada, nobody is in the hospital," my mother, Brenda, replied. Her voice lacked any trace of panic or distress. Instead, it carried that familiar, breezy, overly sweet tone she usually deployed when she was about to ask someone at church to volunteer for a shift she did not want to do. "But we do have a bit of a crisis on our hands with the Aspen trip, and I need you to focus and listen to me." I stood perfectly still in the hallway. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the sheer absurdity of the situation wash over me. She had called my emergency private line during my peak business hours. She was not calling to apologize for the group chat messages from the day before. She was not calling to reprimand Ashley for calling me loud and ghetto. She was calling to talk about the very trip I had been explicitly and brutally uninvited from just 24 hours prior. "I'm in the middle of a board meeting, Mother," I said, keeping my tone entirely flat and devoid of emotion. "If nobody is bleeding or actively dying, I am going to hang up this phone." "Do not you dare hang up on me, Jada!" She snapped her sweet facade, dropping instantly to reveal the demanding matriarch beneath. "This is about family. Since you are not flying out to Aspen this weekend, your father and I realized that you are saving a tremendous amount of money. You are not buying flights, you are not booking a hotel room, and you do not have to buy any new ski gear. So your brother needs a favor from you." I leaned my shoulder against the cool glass wall of the corridor. "A favor," I repeated slowly, tasting the word. "Yes, a favor," Brenda continued, her voice speeding up as if talking faster would somehow make her request sound more reasonable. "The catering bill for the welcome dinner on Friday night is significantly higher than Jamal anticipated. It is $25,000. Ashley's parents have an incredibly exquisite palate, Jada. They regularly dine at Michelin star restaurants in Europe. We simply cannot serve them basic banquet food or some cheap buffet. We need the imported caviar, the Wagyu beef, the custom champagne pairings. We cannot look like regular folks in front of them. We have to show them that our family operates at their level. Jamal needs you to wire the $25,000 directly to his checking account by noon today so he can finalize the vendor payment." I pulled the phone away from my ear for a brief moment, just to stare at the screen and verify that this conversation was actually happening in reality. The unmitigated gall, the absolute breathtaking audacity of this woman. $25,000 was pocket change to me. I routinely approved floral arrangements for my resort lobbies that cost more than that. But the principle of the request was so deeply insulting it defied human logic. They had banned me from attending this party because my single-woman energy did not fit their high society aesthetic. They had allowed my brother's mediocre white fiancé to insult my character and my culture in a group chat. And now, less than a day later, they expected me to quietly open my wallet and fund the very dinner I was forbidden from eating. Let me make sure I am processing this correctly. I said, bringing the phone back to my ear. My voice was dangerously low, a sharp whisper that echoed slightly in the empty hallway. You called my emergency line, pulling me out of a corporate board meeting to demand that I wire $25,000 to Jamal. You want me to fully fund a luxury dinner party that you and Dad explicitly uninvited me from because my presence would embarrass Ashley's white parents. You want my black dollars to fund your aesthetic, but you do not want me in the room. You are twisting my words and being deliberately difficult. Brenda sighed, deploying her classic victim routine. You are always so dramatic, Jada. It is for your brother. You know he is between major investments right now. His startup is just trying to get off the ground, and Ashley's family expects a certain standard of living. As his sister, it is your duty to help him secure his future. You have more money than you know what to do with anyway. No, I said. The word was a hard, immovable wall. Absolutely not. I will not give Jamal a single dime for this trip, and I will not be funding a performance for a family that disrespects me. I heard a sharp gasp on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of scuffling. Suddenly the phone was yanked away, and a deep, booming voice took over the receiver. It was my father, Calvin. He had clearly been listening in the background the entire time, waiting to step in and play the heavy-handed enforcer. "Who do you think you are raising your voice to?" Calvin demanded, his tone vibrating with righteous patriarchal fury. "Listen to me very carefully, little girl. You do not get to speak to your mother with that kind of disrespect." "I am not a little girl, Dad," I replied, my posture straightening. "I am a 35-year-old chief executive officer, and I said no." Calvin ignored my response entirely, launching right into his favorite weapon of choice. He used the exact brand of religious manipulation and respectability politics he had honed over decades as a church deacon. "We sacrificed everything to raise you, Jada," he barked. "We put clothes on your back. We raised you in the church. We taught you the value of family. And this is how you repay us, by hoarding your money out of spite, while your brother is trying to establish his legacy. You are letting your petty, childish jealousy ruin your brother's engagement, because you cannot handle the fact that he is moving up in the world." He did not stop there. He knew exactly where to aim the knife to inflict what he believed would be the maximum amount of psychological damage. He went straight for the societal insecurity he assumed I carried. "This attitude right here is exactly why you are 35 years old and sitting in an empty house every single night." Calvin spat his words, dripping with venom. "You have a selfish, ungodly spirit. You care more about your bank account and your pride than you do about your own blood. No man is ever going to want a woman who operates with such a bitter, unyielding heart. You do not know how to submit. You do not know how to serve your family. And until you prey on your arrogance, you are going to remain entirely alone." He waited for a reaction. He wanted me to break down. He wanted me to cry, to apologize, to desperately wire the $25,000 just to prove to him that I was a good daughter who deserved his love. He wanted to break my spirit so completely that I would happily finance my own exclusion just to earn a crumb of his validation. I stood in the hallway looking through the glass walls into the boardroom where my executive team was patiently waiting for my return. I looked at the multi-million-dollar projections on the screen. I looked at the empire I had built through my own sheer brilliance, late nights, and unyielding determination. I did not need a husband to validate my existence, and I certainly did not need my father's toxic conditional approval. I took a slow, measured breath, keeping my heart rate perfectly steady. "I will be sure to bring all of those highly constructive points up in my next prayer," I said, my voice dripping with absolute ice. "Have a blessed trip, Deacon." I pressed the red button and ended the call, instantly cutting off whatever furious response he was preparing to unleash. I did not block their numbers. I wanted the lines open for the impending fallout. I took 2 seconds to smooth the lapels of my tailored suit, squared my shoulders, and pushed the heavy glass door open, walking right back into my boardroom. I took my place at the head of the table, looking at my quiet, attentive executives. "My apologies for the delay," I said, picking up my laser pointer with a completely steady hand. "Let us get back to the Swiss Alps acquisition." After the board meeting successfully concluded, I retreated to the absolute sanctuary of my private corner office. The Swiss Alps deal was officially closed and finalized, yet my mind refused to settle into its usual rhythm of accomplishment. A nagging, persistent mathematical discrepancy kept scratching at the back of my brain, completely disrupting my focus. It was not a corporate accounting error or a miscalculated vendor contract. It was the fundamental reality of my parents' personal finances. I am a private wealth manager for global elites. I detect financial inconsistencies and spot fraudulent asset inflation for a living, and the math surrounding this sudden Aspen excursion simply was not adding up. My father is a church deacon who reluctantly retired from a mid-level warehouse management position 5 years ago. My mother has not worked a single day since the late 90s, choosing instead to make church auxiliary meetings and gossiping her full-time career. Yet according to the group chat, they were flying first class to Colorado. They were buying custom-tailored winterwear. They were casually discussing $25,000 catering bills and booking luxury accommodations for Ashley's notoriously picky white parents. Jamal certainly was not funding this extravagant trip. My brother's bank account was a desolate wasteland of failed tech startups, abandoned podcast equipment, and bounced checks. So where exactly was this sudden influx of elite wealth coming from? I sat down at my massive desk, opened my encrypted laptop, and bypassed the standard corporate firewall. I logged directly into the highly secure backend of my personal banking network. I needed to see the exact paper trail. I routed my search through the anonymous shell company I use to manage my private real estate holdings and philanthropic trusts. I pulled up the public county property tax records for my parents' address in the Atlanta suburbs. I bypassed the standard public view and accessed the deeper financial filings tied to the deed of the house. What I saw on the high-resolution screen made my blood run entirely cold. There registered just 3 weeks ago was a massive high-interest second mortgage attached to my childhood home. They had leveraged a staggering $150,000 against the property. The predatory interest rate alone was enough to induce a panic attack. I did not stop there. Using the financial monitoring software my firm utilizes for risk assessment, I legally tracked the public disbursement of those specific loan funds. The money had not sat safely in an escrow account or a responsible high-yield savings portfolio. The entire $150,000 had been immediately and aggressively drained. The digital footprints showed massive wire transfers directly into Jamal's personal checking accounts. I traced the corresponding outbound expenditures, watching a horror story unfold in real time. Thousands of dollars spent at luxury travel agencies, massive charges at high-end jewelers for Ashley's engagement ring upgrades, exorbitant bills from designer boutiques in Buckhead for matching cashmere coats, $10,000 for a private jet subscription deposit that Jamal could not even maintain. My parents had literally mortgaged the roof over their own heads. They had eagerly signed away their remaining financial security just to buy Jamal a fake temporary billionaire aesthetic. They were actively gambling their entire future on the delusional hope that this smoke and mirrors performance would impress Ashley's parents enough to secure a marriage. The sheer magnitude of their financial recklessness was horrifying, but the emotional betrayal cut infinitely deeper. The heavy, suffocating irony of this new mortgage was rooted in a secret I had meticulously kept for the past 5 years. 5 years ago, Calvin and Brenda were on the absolute brink of total foreclosure. Jamal had drained their savings dry to fund his second failed mobile app, leaving them entirely unable to pay years of accumulated property taxes. The county was weeks away from seizing the house and putting it up for public auction. They were terrified, weeping openly in church and praying for a miraculous financial rescue to save them from public humiliation. I was the one who provided that miracle. I did not hand them a check knowing my father's fragile, toxic pride could never handle being rescued by the daughter he constantly diminished. I knew he would rather lose his home than admit a single black woman was more successful than his precious male heir. Instead, I established a silent, anonymous shell corporation. I used that corporate entity to pay off every single cent of their back taxes in one lump sum. I went a step further and set up an automated irrevocable trust that quietly covered their property taxes in full every single year. My parents spent the last 5 years believing they were the beneficiaries of some mysterious divine blessing or an anonymous wealthy church donor. My father literally stood before the congregation, tears in his eyes, praising the Lord for opening financial doors, while entirely ignoring the daughter sitting 3 pews back who had actually signed the wire transfer. They had absolutely no idea that the loud single ghetto daughter they constantly marginalized was the sole reason they were not currently sleeping on the street. Now, by taking out this reckless high-risk second mortgage, they had essentially set fire to my silent protection. They had attached a ruthless, predatory lender to the very house I had been quietly saving from the auction block year after year. Their desperation to please a racist old money white family had completely jeopardized my hidden financial safety net. I sat in the utter silence of my office staring at the glowing screen. The absolute, unmitigated disrespect was staggering. They were risking literal homelessness and total bankruptcy for what? To buy their way into a family that would never truly accept them. To appease a mediocre daughter-in-law who openly mocked our culture in a group chat. To prop up a 32-year-old son who refused to get a legitimate job and manipulated them into funding his delusions of grandeur. And the ultimate slap in the face was the conversation I had just endured with my father an hour ago. He had the unmitigated audacity to call me a selfish, bitter woman. He dared to say I possessed an ungodly spirit and cared more about my bank account than my own blood. He shouted those insults while standing inside a house that I was secretly paying to protect, using a phone bought with money he stole from his own home equity. The lingering traces of familial obligation I had carried completely evaporated. The last fragile thread tying me to their toxic ecosystem snapped, leaving behind nothing but cold, executing precision. I realized in that exact moment that I could not save people who were deeply, passionately committed to their own destruction. I closed the laptop with a soft, definitive click. I was done being the silent benefactor to people who despised me. I was done subsidizing my own disrespect. I was not going to intervene. I was not going to call the bank or attempt to pay off this new disastrous loan. I was going to let them feel the absolute crushing weight of their financial choices. If they wanted to play high-stakes games with the elite, I was going to ensure they received the full, unedited luxury experience. They wanted to live in a world where money dictated worth. I was finally going to show them exactly how much power I truly held in that world. DeAndre stepped into my office, the heavy glass door sealing silently behind him. As my head of operations, he was one of the few people allowed to bypass my executive assistant when the situation required immediate action. He moved with the crisp, relentless efficiency that I demanded from everyone in my inner circle. He did not offer a polite greeting or waste time asking how my morning was going. Instead, he dropped a thick matte black portfolio directly in the center of my desk. "I need your final authorization on the VIP weekend dossier," DeAndre said, tapping the leather cover with his index finger. The flagship property was booked a few weeks ago, but the security deposit requirement just flagged in the system for a secondary executive review. Because the requested incidentals exceed our standard tier thresholds. Compliance requires your direct signature before we issue the final security clearance to the local concierge team. I pulled the portfolio toward me, the smooth leather cool against my fingertips. The flagship property he was referring to was not just another high-end vacation rental in our corporate catalog. It was the Obsidian Chalet. The Obsidian Chalet was my absolute pride and joy, the undisputed crown jewel of the Apex Alpine Empire. It was a $20 million architectural masterpiece carved directly into the unforgiving side of Ajax Mountain in Aspen. I had personally overseen every single square inch of its design and construction. I selected the imported black marble for the heated floors. I designed the indoor hot springs that overlooked the snowy cliffs. I authorized the construction of the private temperature-controlled funicular that transported guests directly from the property to the elite ski trails. It was a fortress of extreme unapologetic wealth, designed exclusively to cater to billionaires, international royalty, and high net worth moguls who demanded absolute privacy and unmatched luxury. Booking. The Obsidian Chalet was not something a person could simply do on a public website. It required an extensive vetting process, a background check, and an invitation code. The security deposit alone was $50,000. I flipped open the heavy cover of the dossier and began to scan the crisp printed logistics sheets. The demands were staggering even by our elite standards. The primary guest had requested a full staff, including a private Michelin-trained chef, an on-call masseuse, a fleet of armored black SUVs for town transport, and a fully stocked wine cellar featuring vintage Dom Perignon. The sheer scale of the requested amenities screamed of someone desperately trying to project an image of limitless, unbothered wealth. I turned the page to review the primary reservation holder and the required security manifest. Our corporate protocol mandates that every single individual stepping foot onto our flagship properties must be fully documented and cleared by our private security team prior to arrival. I looked at the bold printed name at the top of the reservation contract, William Kensington. I stared at the name, my eyes locking onto the black ink. I knew that name perfectly well. William Kensington was Ashley's father. He was the supposedly prestigious old money patriarch my parents were currently bankrupting themselves to impress. My heart gave a strange, powerful kick against my ribs. I immediately dragged my finger across the page to check the dates of the reservation. Arrival this Friday morning. Departure on Monday afternoon. They aligned down to the exact hour with the so-called family reunion engagement party. I quickly flipped to the security manifest page, scanning the list of registered guests cleared for entry onto the estate. There, printed in neat alphabetical order, was the entire cast of characters. William Kensington, his wife Patricia Kensington, Ashley Kensington, Jamal Williams, Calvin Williams, Brenda Williams. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The silence in my office suddenly felt deafening, broken only by the faint rhythmic ticking of the designer clock on my wall. They did not just rent some random upscale log cabin in the mountains. They did not just book a nice suite at a luxury hotel. My parents, my golden child brother, and Ashley's incredibly pretentious white family had unknowingly booked my house. They had secured a reservation at the exact flagship property I owned, built and managed. The sheer astronomical irony of the situation washed over me in a massive wave. It was so perfectly poetic that it almost felt orchestrated by a higher power. Just 24 hours ago, my father had called me on the phone to explicitly ban me from this trip. He had confidently told me that my loud, single-woman energy would make their gathering look ghetto. He had insisted that I would completely ruin the high society aesthetic they were so desperately trying to maintain for Ashley's refined family. Yet here they were actively paying top dollar to exist inside an aesthetic that I had personally created. They were going to walk through towering glass doors that I purchased. They were going to sleep on custom Italian silk sheets that I selected. They were going to breathe air that was filtered by a state-of-the-art HVAC system I approved. They were stepping directly into the absolute center of my kingdom, completely oblivious to the fact that the faceless multi-million-dollar luxury corporation they were renting from was owned entirely by the daughter they had deemed too embarrassing to invite. I let out a slow, deep breath, staring down at the names on the paper. I thought about my mother draining the equity from her home just to help fund this illusion. I thought about Jamal puffing out his chest, pretending to be a wildly successful entrepreneur while walking the halls of my estate. I thought about Ashley, the woman who had mocked me in a group chat just yesterday, kicking off her snow boots by a massive stone fireplace that my money had built. DeAndre shifted his weight, his sharp eyes studying my face. He had worked with me long enough to recognize the subtle shifts in my demeanor. "Is there an issue with the Kensington booking?" "Jada," he asked, his voice low and serious. Security ran the standard background checks on all the individuals listed on the manifest. No criminal flags were triggered, but the financial verification on the primary deposit did require a manual override due to the routing structure. "If you are not comfortable with the risk profile of this specific party, I can have the concierge team revoke the clearance and terminate the contract right now. I looked up from the dossier and met DeAndre's gaze. A slow, incredibly dangerous smile began to curve at the corners of my mouth, the kind of smile a predator makes right before the trap snaps completely shut on its prey. No, DeAndre. I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet humming with absolute undeniable power. There is no issue at all. In fact, this is the most flawless booking we have secured all quarter. I reached for my heavy gold pen resting beside my keyboard. I did not hesitate. I pressed the nib to the thick paper and signed my name with sweeping aggressive strokes on the final authorization line, officially granting my family and their parasitic guests full unrestricted access to the Obsidian Chalet. I closed the portfolio and slid it back across the desk toward him. Process the authorization immediately, I instructed, leaning back in my leather executive chair. But I need to see the billing profile they used to secure the initial $50,000 deposit. Pull up the exact corporate code and the payment method currently on file for this specific reservation. Bring it to me right now. DeAndre nodded, taking the portfolio without questioning my sudden interest in the granular accounting details. He turned and walked briskly out of my office, leaving me entirely alone with the revelation. I swiveled my chair around to face the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city of Atlanta. The anger and betrayal that had been sitting heavy in my chest all morning completely evaporated, replaced by a surge of pure, unfiltered adrenaline. My family wanted a high society experience. They wanted to rub elbows with the elite and pretend they belonged in the upper echelons of wealth. They were about to get exactly what they paid for, and I was going to make absolutely certain that the final bill cost them everything. Less than 3 minutes later, the heavy glass door of my office swung open. DeAndre marched back in carrying a sleek silver tablet displaying the highly secure financial backend of the Kensington reservation. He placed the device directly in front of me on the glass desk. The screen was illuminated with the itemized billing ledger breaking down every single exorbitant charge associated with the upcoming weekend in Aspen. I swiped my manicured finger across the smooth glass, scrolling through a masterclass in financial delusion. The sheer scale of their greed was breathtaking. They had not just booked the estate for a quiet family getaway. They had meticulously selected every single premium upgrade available in our corporate catalog. The ledger showed requests for imported white truffles, a private helipad clearance round-the-clock massage therapists, and a dedicated team of 5 private ski instructors. They were actively treating the reservation portal like a blank check piling on luxury services, as if money were a completely infinite resource. But what immediately caught my eye, what made my executive instincts flare with sudden alarm, was the pricing column on the right side of the screen. A massive, unprecedented discount had been applied to the base daily rate of the $20 million property. I tapped the line item to expand the details. Someone had manually entered a highly restricted Tier 1 corporate override code. It was an internal legacy code designed exclusively for our board members and elite brand ambassadors. It slashed the nightly rental cost by 70%, but it triggered a mandatory, non-negotiable $50,000 security deposit to cover the high-end incidentals and protect the valuable artwork inside the chalet. My eyes darted down to the payment method section. I needed to see exactly whose money was securing this colossal lie. The primary payment method registered for the $50,000 deposit was an American Express Centurion card. The name typed into the billing profile was William Kensington, Ashley's father. But as my eyes moved past the fraudulent name and locked onto the last 4 digits of the physical card, a sudden, icy shockwave ripped straight through my chest. I knew those numbers. I knew that specific numerical sequence as intimately as I knew my own social security number. I kept my face perfectly neutral, not allowing a single muscle to twitch. I opened the encrypted Vault application on my secure desktop computer. I bypassed the dual authentication protocols and pulled up the master list of all corporate accounts registered under my parent holding company. I scrolled past the active operational accounts and clicked on the dormant reserve files. I cross-referenced the digits on DeAndre's tablet with the database. It was a perfect, indisputable match. The credit card being used to secure the Obsidian Chalet did not belong to William Kensington. It belonged to an old, highly secured business account registered under a private LLC that I completely controlled. It was an emergency corporate reserve card issued directly in my name, with a spending limit that stretched well into the seven figures. My mind instantly snapped back to the fourth Thursday of November last year. Thanksgiving dinner at my parents' cramped suburban home. The air had been thick with the smell of roasted turkey, and the sound of my mother loudly praising Jamal for his latest entirely fabricated tech venture. I had arrived straight from the airport after closing a deal in London, carrying my heavy leather travel tote. I had placed my bag in the guest bedroom, tossed my coat on the bed, and walked into the kitchen to greet my family. I vividly remembered walking back down the hallway an hour later to grab my phone charger. I had caught Jamal slipping out of that exact guest bedroom. His eyes were wide, his posture stiff, and a light sheen of sweat coated his forehead. He had mumbled a pathetic excuse about looking for an extra chair and quickly scurried back to the dining room. I had not thought twice about it at the time. I never noticed the physical card was missing because it was tucked into a hidden zippered emergency compartment deep inside my travel wallet. It was a card I only ever used for major international vendor wires and catastrophic emergencies. I had not physically looked at it in months. Jamal had not just snooped through my belongings, he had completely violated my privacy, dug through my secure travel bag, and stolen a limitless corporate black card right out of my purse while I was sitting in the next room eating dinner. And he had held on to it. He had kept it hidden for months, waiting for the perfect opportunity to deploy it. He did not just steal my money to buy a new car or pay off his mounting debts. He stole my corporate identity to bankroll a fraudulent high society performance. He had deliberately typed Ashley's father's name into the billing profile to make it look like old money wealth, using my stolen credit line to bypass the rigorous financial vetting process of my own company. The layers of this crime were absolutely staggering. Jamal had committed federal wire fraud. He had committed grand larceny. He had committed identity theft across state lines. And he had used a stolen financial instrument to secure access to a $20 million asset. He was operating with the kind of reckless, staggering stupidity that could result in a decade inside a federal penitentiary. But the irony, the deep, delicious, cinematic irony of the entire situation was almost too brilliant for words. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and watching my enemies happily tie anchors around their own ankles. Just hours ago, my father had called me to tell me I was uninvited. He had told me that I was a liability. He had said that my loud single-woman energy would make their elegant gathering look ghetto. Ashley had mocked me in the group chat, claiming I would not fit into their highly exclusive, refined world. They had completely written me off, treating me like a shameful secret that needed to be locked in the basement while they entertained their prestigious white guests. Yet their entire high society performance was literally financed by my stolen black wealth. Every single ounce of their fake elite aesthetic was built on the back of the very woman they were excluding. They were actively trying to impress a family of racist, broke grifters by using the stolen credit line of a black female chief executive officer. They believed they were pulling off the ultimate scam against a faceless, elite, white-owned conglomerate. They were entirely unaware that the faceless corporation they were defrauding was owned, managed, and controlled by the sister they had deemed too uncultured to attend. DeAndre leaned forward, resting his hands on the edge of my glass desk. He had been watching my face intently. As the head of operations, he had memorized the routing prefixes for all of our major corporate accounts. He saw the numbers on the screen, and he saw the recognition in my eyes. Jada, DeAndre said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a sharp protective edge. That routing prefix matches your private reserve LLC. That is your corporate card on the security deposit. Someone has compromised your financial identity. Give me the word and I will trigger the immediate fraud alert. I will lock down the entire account, cancel the reservation, and dispatch local law enforcement to Aspen right now to arrest whoever attempts to check in on Friday. I looked at DeAndre. I looked at the tablet displaying the stolen numbers. I thought about my mother draining the equity from her house to buy cashmere coats. I thought about Jamal strutting around like a billionaire patriarch. I thought about Ashley claiming I lacked class. I reached out and gently pushed the tablet back toward DeAndre. "You will do absolutely no such thing," I said, my voice steady, calm, and laced with absolute venom. "You will not flag the transaction. You will not trigger a fraud alert. You will let the $50,000 authorization process exactly as they submitted it. We are not calling the police to stop them from checking in." DeAndre stared at me, his sharp eyes narrowing as he processed the magnitude of my command. "You want to let them inside the property. You want to let them commit federal fraud against your own company." "I want them to get incredibly comfortable, DeAndre," I replied, rising from my leather chair and smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. "I want them to walk through those towering glass doors. I want them to order the caviar. I want them to pop the imported champagne. I want them to look Ashley's parents dead in the eyes and pretend they own the entire mountain. You do not interrupt an enemy when they are actively destroying themselves. You simply hand them a bigger hammer." I walked around the desk, the fire of absolute retribution burning in my veins. "Process the booking. Authorize the upgrades. Let the trap be completely set. Because I am not just going to cancel a reservation. I am going to let them build a beautiful, fragile glass castle right in the middle of a blizzard. And then I'm going to shatter it from the inside out." DeAndre stood firmly in the center of my office, his sharp eyes locking onto mine as his brain processed the sheer magnitude of my directive. Before I poached him to be the head of operations for Apex Alpine, he had been a ruthless corporate litigator at a top-tier firm. His legal instincts immediately calculated the massive fallout of letting a fraudulent transaction proceed unchecked on our own servers. He crossed his arms over his chest, his tailored suit shifting with the movement. "You want me to let your brother actively commit federal wire fraud against your own company?" DeAndre said, his voice dropping into a low, serious register. "You want me to let him use your stolen corporate black card to secure a $20 million asset so you can catch him in the act in front of his prospective in-laws?" "Exactly," I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the cool glass of my desk. "If we cancel the card right now, Jamal will simply play the eternal victim. He will call our parents and tell them his bank made an administrative error. He will spin a pathetic lie about a frozen account or a wire transfer delay. My father will blindly believe him, and my mother will probably blame the banking system for being racially biased against young black male entrepreneurs. They will find some other way to scrape together a mediocre dinner, and Ashley's pompous parents will never see the truth. I am not giving my family an exit strategy. I am not giving them a convenient excuse to save face." I walked over to the massive digital smartboard mounted on my office wall and brought up the property management dashboard for the Obsidian Chalet. The screen illuminated with the breathtaking images of the estate showcasing the dark stone architecture, the heated infinity pool overlooking the snowy cliffs, and the grand dining hall. "We are going to give them enough rope to hang themselves their fake high society aesthetic and this entire fraudulent wedding," I said, tapping the screen to open the reservation details. I turned back to DeAndre. "Do not just process the booking. I want you to actively upgrade them." DeAndre raised a single eyebrow, a slow, deeply appreciative smile spreading across his face. He understood exactly what kind of psychological warfare I was engaging in. Upgrade them to what he asked. They already requested the platinum tier services. "Push them to the diamond tier," I instructed, my voice crisp and commanding. "I want the local Aspen concierge team to treat William Kensington and Jamal Williams like they are visiting heads of state. When they arrive at the private airstrip, I want a fleet of our armored black SUVs waiting on the tarmac. When they walk through the heavy front doors of the chalet, I want them greeted with towering trays of imported beluga caviar and our most expensive vintage champagne." I walked back to my desk and picked up my tablet, actively authorizing a massive extension on the security deposit hold. "Tell the staff to say yes to absolutely everything. If Ashley wants to book a private ski instructor for the entire weekend, approve it immediately. If her parents want to schedule in sweet hot stone massages with our premium therapists, confirm the appointments without hesitation." If Jamal decides he wants to host a private whiskey tasting featuring bottles that cost $5,000 a pour, pop the corks and pour the drinks. I wanted them to become completely intoxicated by the luxury. I wanted my parents to sit by the massive stone fireplace, wrapped in cashmere throws, believing that their golden son had finally delivered the billionaire lifestyle he had been promising them for a decade. I wanted Ashley's broke, grifting parents to gorge themselves on my dime, entirely convinced that they had successfully married their mediocre daughter into immense generational wealth. Let them rack up thousands of dollars in incidental charges? I continued feeling the absolute intoxicating power of the trap locking firmly into place. Let the bill run sky high. Let them order the truffles. Let them book the private helicopter tours over the mountain peaks. Every single time they ask for something, the staff is to smile, nod, and charge it directly to that stolen credit card profile. Place a silent override on the payment gateway so the card does not flag for fraud until I give the manual command. I want that final bill to look like a phone number. DeAndre typed rapidly on his secure tablet, overriding the system limits and setting the financial snare exactly to my specifications. The staff in Aspen will be briefed within the hour, he confirmed. They will not know the true identities of the guests or your relation to them. They will only know that these individuals are high-profile targets authorized by corporate to receive unrestricted service. The trap is officially set, Jada. Excellent, I said, grabbing my suit jacket. Now clear my schedule for the rest of the week. I have a family reunion to attend. I left the corporate headquarters with a fierce, burning energy coursing through my veins. My driver navigated my sleek town car back to my primary residence, a sprawling multi-level penthouse overlooking the entire city of Atlanta. I walked through the heavy double doors and headed straight for my custom walk-in closet. I did not pack a standard weekend bag. I was packing for a highly specific tactical execution. If my father wanted to explicitly exclude me because I did not fit their delicate high society aesthetic, I was going to show up looking like I owned the entire mountain. Which, legally speaking, I did. I pulled out my designer travel trunks and began selecting my winter wardrobe with ruthless precision. I bypassed the standard ski gear and reached for the absolute top-tier pieces in my collection. I pulled down a stunning, pristine white Moncler ski suit that retailed for over $4,000. It was sleek, unapologetically luxurious, and commanded immediate attention. I paired it with custom-fitted thermal layers, shearling-lined boots, and a collection of subtle but blindingly expensive diamond jewelry. I packed my vintage sunglasses and a statement fur-trimmed coat that screamed old money power. My phone buzzed constantly on the marble vanity counter as I packed. The family group chat was still highly active. Brenda was posting prayer hands publicly, thanking God for the incredible financial blessings raining down on Jamal. Jamal had the unmitigated audacity to post a motivational quote about the hustle and grind paying off while literally stealing from his own sister. Ashley was sending pictures of her packing her bags, bragging about the designer outfits she planned to wear to the welcome dinner. I ignored all of them. Their digital arrogance was just fuel for the fire I was preparing to light. Within 2 hours, I was fully packed and stepping out onto the private tarmac of the regional executive airport. The freezing evening wind whipped around me as I walked toward the waiting Gulfstream plane, one of the primary jets in the Apex Alpine corporate fleet. The flight crew stood at attention near the gleaming white stairs, offering warm, respectful greetings as I approached. "Good evening, Miss Williams," the lead flight attendant said, taking my heavy leather travel tote. "We have your preferred dinner ready, and we are cleared for a direct flight to Aspen. Flight time will be just under 4 hours. "Thank you, Claire," I replied, stepping into the luxurious mahogany-lined cabin of the private jet. I sank into the oversized leather captain chair, feeling the quiet, powerful hum of the jet engines vibrating beneath me. As the plane taxied down the runway and smoothly ascended into the dark night sky, I looked out the oval window at the shrinking city lights below. I was leaving behind the disrespect, the endless microaggressions, and the decades of toxic family politics. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, resting the crystal glass on the polished table. My family thought they had successfully locked me out of the most important weekend of their lives. They thought they had outsmarted the system, secured their fake billionaire status, and completely erased me from the narrative. They were currently flying commercial, sipping warm soda in economy class, totally oblivious to the storm that was rapidly approaching their rented castle. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the sheer, terrifying power of absolute control. I was flying to Aspen. I was bringing the hammer down. And I was going to make sure that not a single one of them ever forgot my name. The Gulfstream touched down on the icy tarmac of the Aspen-Pitkin County Airport, just as the morning sun began to rise over the jagged mountain peaks. I stepped out of the cabin, the biting, crisp Colorado air instantly hitting my face and waking up every single nerve ending in my body. A heavily tinted armored black SUV was already waiting for me right on the runway, its engine purring quietly in the cold. My private security driver stepped forward, taking my heavy leather travel tote and opening the rear door with a respectful, silent nod. I slid into the heated leather seat, smoothing the pristine white fabric of my ski suit. The drive up the mountain was a masterclass in anticipation. As we navigated the winding, snow-covered roads, my pulse maintained a steady, powerful rhythm. I thought about my family crammed into economy seats on a commercial flight yesterday, loudly bragging to the flight attendants about their elite vacation, completely oblivious to the reality of the world they were stepping into. We approached the heavily gated perimeter of the Obsidian Chalet. From the outside, the property looked like a modern fortress carved directly into the dark, unforgiving stone of the mountain. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows glowed with warm golden light against the stark white snow. It was a monument to absolute, unbothered wealth, and it belonged entirely to me. I instructed my driver to bypass the grand main entrance completely. I had absolutely no intention of walking through those front doors and giving my family the opportunity to spot me early. I needed total tactical surprise. The SUV glided around the side of the mountain to the private subterranean security garage, reserved exclusively for ownership and high-level corporate staff. I stepped out into the climate-controlled parking bay and walked purposefully toward the secured executive elevator. There was a biometric scanner mounted on the concrete wall next to the polished steel doors. I bypassed it, pulling my Master Chief Executive Officer keycard from my pocket. I tapped the heavy black card against the reader. The small light instantly turned green, granting me unrestricted, untraceable access to the entire estate. The elevator shot upward silently, bypassing the main guest floors and heading straight for the top level. The doors slid open to reveal my private penthouse suite. It was a sprawling, immaculate space that hung over the rest of the chalet like a crown. The walls were clad in dark, textured wood, and the furnishings were impossibly sleek and minimalist. It was totally silent up here, completely insulated from the noise of the lower floors. I dropped my bag on the custom leather sofa and walked softly toward the edge of the room. The penthouse featured a massive interior glass balcony that looked directly down into the grand dining hall below. I stepped up to the thick reinforced glass and looked down at the sprawling scene unfolding beneath my feet. It was like watching a perfectly choreographed, incredibly pathetic stage play. The grand hall was buzzing with intense activity. My operations team had clearly followed my instructions to the letter, treating these fraudulent guests like absolute royalty. A small army of private staff in crisp uniforms moved swiftly across the heated marble floors, carrying towering arrangements of imported white orchids and setting the massive 20-seat dining table with our absolute finest crystal and polished silver. And right in the middle of it all was my family, completely drunk on the illusion of their own status. My mother, Brenda, was standing near the massive stone fireplace. She was wearing a ridiculous, clearly brand new cashmere sweater that she had bought with the money she drained from her own house. She was pointing and gesturing wildly, actively, bossing my highly trained staff around, as if she had grown up with a personal butler catering to her every whim. My father, Calvin, was lounging in a custom leather armchair, swirling a glass of amber liquid, and looking around the room with a smug, deeply satisfied expression. He looked like a man who genuinely believed he had finally arrived at the very top of the social ladder. Jamal was pacing near the front windows, talking loudly on his cell phone, puffing his chest out and acting like the young billionaire patriarch he so desperately wanted to be. A few moments later, Ashley walked into the grand hall flanked by her parents. They were looking around the $20 million room with wide, greedy eyes. I could see the sheer calculation in their expressions. Ashley's parents were completely mesmerized by the scale of the wealth, entirely unaware that the man they were trying to marry their daughter off to was a broke, unemployed fraud who had literally stolen his sister's credit card to rent the room they were currently standing in. They were all feeding off each other's fake prestige, building a magnificent, fragile glass house of lies right inside my actual house. I watched them for a few more minutes, soaking in the absolute delusion of the moment. Then I turned away from the interior glass and walked toward the heavy sliding doors that led out to my private exterior balcony. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the freezing mountain air. The view from up here was genuinely spectacular. The majestic dark stone architecture of the chalet jutted out below me, perfectly framing the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains in the distance. The morning sun hit the fresh powder, making the entire landscape sparkle like crushed diamonds. It was the absolute pinnacle of an elite, untouchable lifestyle. I zipped my $4,000 white Moncler ski suit all the way up, adjusted the collar, and slid my vintage designer sunglasses onto my face. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened my camera. I angled the lens to perfectly capture my flawless outfit, the distinct architectural overhang of the chalet balcony, and the towering mountains directly behind me. The framing was undeniable. Anyone who had spent even 5 minutes looking at the exterior of this property would instantly know exactly where I was standing. I snapped the picture. I did not need filters or heavy edits. The raw, unfiltered reality of my powerful presence was more than enough. I opened the family group chat. The exact same group chat where Ashley had called me ghetto and claimed I would not fit into their refined world. The exact same group chat where my parents had praised Jamal for his high society aesthetic while happily leaving me in the shadows. I pasted the pristine photo directly into the thread. I typed my message quickly, letting the heavy, devastating irony speak for itself. Aspen is lovely this time of year. Shame we could not link up. I added a skier emoji and a snowflake emoji for the perfect touch of condescending cheerfulness. I hit send on the family group chat, and then I immediately posted the exact same photo and caption to my public Instagram story. I locked my screen, slid the phone back into my pocket, and stood on the balcony, taking a slow, deep breath as the freezing wind whipped around my face. The bait was officially in the water, the countdown had begun, and the trap was ready to violently snap shut. I stepped back inside the penthouse and pulled the heavy glass door shut against the freezing mountain wind. I walked over to the massive kitchen island and dropped my phone onto the polished black marble counter. I did not even have time to take off my vintage sunglasses before the absolute silence of the suite was completely shattered. It took exactly 3 minutes. Not 5, not 10. 3 minutes for the digital bomb to detonate across the family group chat. My phone began to vibrate with such intense and violent frequency that it actually rattled across the slick marble surface, threatening to launch itself onto the hardwood floor. The screen lit up and flashed continuously, with a relentless barrage of notifications. It was a beautiful and chaotic symphony of absolute panic. I casually unzipped my ski jacket, poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the minibar, and walked back over to the counter. I leaned over the phone, watching the caller ID flash wildly between my mother, my father, and my brother. They were calling back to back, frantically trying to intercept me, desperate to contain the sudden and unpredictable variable I had just introduced into their perfectly curated weekend. I let every single call go straight to voicemail. I wanted them to sit in the unbearable agony of the unknown, sweating in their expensive stolen clothes while they tried to figure out how the daughter they discarded had managed to find them. When the incoming calls finally stopped, the text messages began pouring in like a desperate avalanche. I picked up the device, swiped open the screen, and tapped on the family thread to read the damage. My mother, Brenda, had immediately abandoned her sweet, pious church lady persona. Her texts were frantic, littered with typos that betrayed her rapidly escalating heart rate. She demanded to know my exact location. She typed, Jada, where are you right now? You are supposed to be in Atlanta. Why are you in Colorado? Tell me you are at a different resort. Tell me you did not follow us here to ruin your brother's engagement. My father Calvin chimed in right after her, his messages dripping with his usual aggressive patriarchal authority. He commanded me to answer the phone immediately. He wrote, "I explicitly told you that you were not welcome on this trip. If you show your face anywhere near Ashley's family, I will personally see to it that you are removed. You are embarrassing this family. Do not take another step toward this estate." The sheer terror radiating through their digital demands was palpable. They were completely terrified that the loud single ghetto daughter they had shoved into the shadows was about to waltz into their high society performance and shatter the illusion they had spent hundreds of thousands of stolen dollars to create. They genuinely thought I was some desperate, jealous sibling who had scraped together enough money for a commercial flight just to crash their party. They had absolutely no idea that they were sitting inside a multi-million-dollar trap I had built with my own hands. Then came the responses from the guests of honor. Jamal, sensing his fake billionaire patriarch aesthetic was under immediate threat, unleashed his furious panic into the chat. His text read, "What are you doing here? Did you follow us? Are you seriously stalking my fiancée and her family right now? You are completely out of control, Jada. We are at one of the most exclusive properties in the entire state. You cannot just show up here. You do not belong here. Stay away from us." It was incredibly amusing watching a 32-year-old man who still needed my parents to pay his car insurance try to lecture a self-made chief executive officer about what luxury spaces she belonged in. But the absolute crowning jewel of the group chat meltdown came from Ashley. Her message popped up on the screen dripping with the exact kind of racial microaggressions and unearned superiority I fully expected from her. Ashley typed, "This is a private, highly secure estate, Jada. It is not some public club you can just walk into. My parents paid top dollar for absolute privacy. Security is going to arrest you if you try to step foot on these grounds. You are so ghetto and completely obsessed with us. Please get some professional help and leave my family alone." I read Ashley's message twice, letting the sheer breathtaking audacity of her words sink in. She was sitting in my living room eating premium caviar paid for by my stolen credit card, actively threatening me with my own security team. She was attempting to weaponize the exclusivity of my own property against me. She genuinely believed her proximity to whiteness and her fabricated old money status made her untouchable. She thought she could snap her fingers and have the hired help throw me out into the snow like a common trespasser. The staggering level of entitlement required to call a black woman ghetto while literally squatting in her $20 million home was a level of delusion I could barely comprehend. My family had empowered this mediocre woman to speak to me with absolute contempt, prioritizing her comfort over my dignity. They had armed her with stolen wealth and told her she was a queen. I could have written a novel in response. I could have typed a massive, furious paragraph completely dissecting their financial ruin. I could have attached the official property deed directly into the group chat and watched their brains short-circuit in real time. I could have humiliated Jamal by exposing his stolen credit card scheme right then and there, tagging the local police department in the chat for good measure. But typing a long emotional defense was exactly what they expected from the bitter, jealous sister they had created in their minds. It would give them the satisfaction of knowing they had successfully provoked me. They wanted a frantic emotional argument to prove to Ashley's parents that I was the unstable one. I was going to give them a cold corporate execution instead. I tapped the reply bar at the bottom of the screen. I did not justify my presence in Aspen. I did not explain how I found them. I did not mention the private jet, the master keycard, or the stolen funds currently draining my corporate reserve account. I kept my response razor-sharp, lethally concise, and perfectly calibrated to inflict maximum psychological damage. I wanted to deliver a message that would instantly strip away their false sense of security and leave them drowning in pure, unadulterated dread. I typed a single devastating sentence. "Security works for me, Ashley. See you at dinner. I hit send. I did not wait for the read receipts to populate on the screen. I did not wait to watch the typing bubbles appear as they frantically tried to decipher what my message meant. I immediately engaged the Do Not Disturb mode on my device and tossed it back onto the marble counter. The conversation was officially over. I turned my back on the phone and walked toward the master suite to prepare for the evening. The silence in the penthouse was absolute and deeply comforting, but I knew the grand dining hall directly beneath my feet was currently erupting into total chaos. The fuse was officially lit, the countdown was over, and I had exactly 3 hours to get dressed for the absolute best dinner party of my entire life. I spent exactly 3 hours transforming myself from a weary corporate executive into a weapon of absolute destruction. I bypassed the standard formal wear and selected a midnight blue double-breasted tailored tuxedo suit that I had custom commissioned in Milan. The fabric was sharp and structured, radiating a level of flawless authority that could not be bought off a retail rack. I paired it with diamond stud earrings, a sleek pulled-back hairstyle, and a pair of razor-sharp stiletto heels. I did not dress to blend in with a cozy mountain gathering. I dressed to completely dominate the room. When I looked in the full-length mirror of the penthouse suite, I did not see a discarded daughter or a bitter sister. I saw the sole owner of a $20 million estate preparing to inspect her property. I left the penthouse and walked toward the private mezzanine that overlooked the grand dining hall. The heavy, soundproof doors slid open, and the ambient noise of the extravagant welcome dinner immediately washed over me. The sound was a sickeningly perfect symphony of fake prestige. The hired string quartet was playing a soft, classical piece in the corner. Crystal glasses clinked continuously as my highly trained staff moved seamlessly through the crowd, pouring imported vintage champagne and serving the very caviar I had personally authorized just hours ago. I stepped onto the top of the grand glass staircase. The staircase was a stunning architectural centerpiece that curved gracefully down right into the center of the main hall. I placed my hand on the polished steel railing and took my first step down. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels against the glass treads cut through the soft music like a metronome counting down to an explosion. There were roughly 40 people gathered in the room. Half of them were my parents, incredibly pretentious church friends flown out specifically to act as an adoring audience for my brother. The other half consisted of Ashley's extended family, a collection of stiff, sour-faced individuals desperately trying to exude an aura of generational wealth while eagerly drinking on my dime. At the center of it all was the head table draped in heavy white linen and overflowing with imported white orchids. I took another step down, then another. My brother Jamal was the first person to notice me. He was standing near the head table holding a glass of champagne and loudly recounting a completely fabricated story about his latest business venture to one of Ashley's uncles. I watched his eyes casually drift upward toward the staircase. The moment his gaze locked onto my face, the smug, arrogant smile completely vanished from his lips. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. He froze, his mouth hanging slightly open, his champagne flute hovering inches from his chest. Ashley followed his line of sight. Her eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror. She grabbed Jamal's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his jacket sleeve as she stared up at me, descending into her perfect fairy tale. The reaction spread through the room like a viral contagion. One by one, the guests stopped talking. The polite laughter abruptly died in their throats. People nudged the person standing next to them and pointed toward the glass staircase. By the time I reached the halfway point of the descent, the entire room of 40 people had gone completely deafeningly silent. The only sound left in the cavernous hall was the quiet playing of the string quartet, whose musicians had the professional sense to keep playing, and the sharp, steady click of my stilettos closing the distance. My mother, Brenda, was standing near the fireplace. She dropped her cocktail napkin on the floor, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. She looked like she had just seen a ghost walk into her living room. I reached the bottom of the staircase and stepped gracefully onto the heated marble floor of the main hall. I did not look angry. I did not look frantic or unhinged. I looked completely at peace, offering a calm, terrifyingly polite smile to the sea of shocked faces staring back at me. Before I could take 3 steps into the crowd, my father intercepted me. Calvin practically sprinted across the room, moving with a desperate, frantic energy that completely shattered his dignified deacon persona. He plastered a massive, incredibly fake smile onto his face for the benefit of the watching crowd, but his eyes were bulging with pure, unadulterated rage. He stepped directly into my path, using his large frame to block me from advancing any further toward the head table. He grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging painfully into the fabric of my tailored suit jacket, and attempted to forcefully steer me toward a darkened alcove near the coat check room. I stopped walking immediately. I looked down at his hand, gripping my arm, then looked directly into his eyes, with a gaze so cold it made him physically flinch. He let go of my jacket, as if the fabric had suddenly caught fire. He leaned in close, his face inches from mine, and began to whisper furiously through gritted teeth. His voice was a venomous, panicked hiss designed to stay hidden from Ashley's parents, who were watching us from across the room. "I told you not to come!" Calvin spat his breath, hot and ragged. "What is wrong with you? You are humiliating us in front of these people. This is the most important night of your brother's life, and you show up here uninvited just to cause a scene. You are ruining everything we have built." I did not respond. I simply maintained my perfectly neutral, pleasant smile, watching him unravel. My complete lack of an emotional reaction only fueled his desperate anger. "I will not let you destroy this family with your bitter jealousy." Calvin continued, his whispered threats growing more aggressive. "You need to turn around and walk right back out that door. I do not care how you got up this mountain, but you are leaving right now. Get out before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." I almost laughed out loud at the profound absurdity of his threat. My father was actively threatening to call the local authorities to remove me from a property that I legally owned, while he was currently standing on my floors, using my stolen corporate credit card. The sheer magnitude of his delusion was staggering. Before I could deliver my response, a new player entered the confrontation. William Kensington, Ashley's father, stepped out of the crowd and strode purposefully toward us. He was a tall, pompous man wearing a ridiculous ascot and a velvet blazer that looked like it belonged in a cheap community theater production of a British period drama. He carried himself with the bloated, arrogant swagger of a man who firmly believed his whiteness, and his fabricated bank account made him the most important person in any room he entered. He stopped next to Calvin, swirling a glass of dark amber scotch. He did not look at me like I was a human being. He looked me up and down with an expression of clear, undeniable racial and class disdain. His eyes swept over my face, my suit, and my presence with the kind of deep disgust reserved for an insect that had somehow crawled onto his pristine dining table. "Is there a problem here, Calvin?" William asked. His tone was dripping with heavy condescension, treating my father not as an equal but as a subordinate who was failing to manage his unruly, chaotic relatives. "Ashley warned us that your daughter had a history of being disruptive, but I hardly expected her to aggressively crash a private, highly secure engagement dinner." Calvin immediately shrank in William's presence. My father, a man who demanded absolute submission from his wife and daughter, instantly bowed his head and began apologizing profusely to this arrogant stranger. "William, I am so deeply sorry for this unfortunate disruption." Calvin stammered, his voice dripping with pathetic subservience. "Jada has always struggled with boundaries. She is leaving right now. I will handle this immediately so your family can go back to enjoying the evening." William took a slow sip of his scotch, his eyes never leaving my face. He clearly enjoyed watching my father grovel at his feet. He wanted to assert his ultimate dominance over the situation, to prove to everyone watching that he was the apex predator in the room. He let out a dry, arrogant scoff and stepped slightly closer to me, looking down his nose. "If your father cannot manage to control you, young lady," William said, his voice loud enough for the guests at the surrounding tables to hear clearly, "should I have my people handle this trespasser? I can easily have my private security detail drag you off this mountain and hand you over to the local authorities. We do not tolerate this kind of ghetto behavior in our circles." He smirked fully, expecting me to cower in fear at his display of supreme authority. He expected me to drop my head in shame, apologize for my intrusion, and run crying out into the snow like a defeated child. He thought his empty threats and his fake old money status gave him the power to dismiss me from my own kingdom. I looked at William. I looked at my father, who was actively nodding along and agreeing with the man who had just insulted my race and my character. I looked at Jamal, who was hiding behind the head table, too cowardly to step forward and face the mess he had created. I did not cower. I did not retreat. I felt a rush of absolute, untouchable power flood my veins. The trap was completely full, the audience was perfectly silent and attentive, and it was finally time to execute the drop. I stared directly into William Kensington's arrogant eyes. He expected a reaction. He wanted me to shrink under the weight of his fabricated authority. He was waiting for the moment I would succumb to his racial intimidation and classist threats. Instead of giving him that satisfaction, I let out a soft, melodic laugh. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I simply offered him a smile so devoid of warmth it could have frozen the champagne in his glass. I stepped cleanly around him, completely ignoring his existence, as if he were nothing more than a minor architectural flaw in the room. Calvin tried to grab my arm again, but I shot him a look of absolute concentrated warning that glued his feet to the marble floor. My heels clicked with a steady, lethal rhythm as I walked effortlessly past the stunned guests. I bypassed the whispering church ladies and the wide-eyed relatives. I strode directly to the very front of the room, taking my place at the head table. It was the exact spot reserved for the guests of honor. I reached out and picked up a tall crystal champagne flute. I grabbed a polished silver dessert spoon resting next to an immaculate floral centerpiece. I raised the glass high into the air and tapped the side of it with the spoon. A sharp, clear chime rang out across the vast dining hall. I struck it a second time, then a third. The residual whispers in the room died instantly. Every single pair of eyes locked onto me. The string quartet in the corner finally stopped playing, leaving the grand space engulfed in total breathless silence. 40 people stared at me, completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of my presence. "Good evening," I said, projecting my voice with the flawless, commanding cadence I used in international boardrooms. "I want to sincerely welcome you all to the Obsidian. I hope every single one of you is thoroughly enjoying the imported beluga caviar and the vintage Dom Perignon. I should know exactly how exceptional it is. I personally curated the menu." A wave of profound confusion rippled through the crowd. Ashley looked at her mother, her face twisting in angry disbelief. Brenda clutched the back of a dining chair, her knuckles turning white as she tried to process my words. I lowered the glass and set it down on the table, leaning forward slightly, so my voice carried to the very back of the hall. As the chief executive officer and sole owner of Apex Alpine, I like to ensure my guests are spectacularly comfortable. So please eat, drink, and enjoy the amenities my company provides. For a moment, the silence was so heavy it felt tangible. The guests looked around, waiting for someone to explain the joke. They were waiting for security to rush in and drag away the delusional trespasser. The idea that a 35-year-old black woman standing before them could own a $20 million ski estate was completely unfathomable to their prejudiced minds. Suddenly, a loud, forced bark of laughter erupted from the left side of the room. It was Jamal. My brother stepped out from behind the shadow of a massive stone pillar, clapping his hands together in a slow, mocking rhythm. He walked toward the center of the floor, desperately trying to project confidence. He needed to protect his fragile ego in front of his wealthy future in-laws, and his only defense mechanism was to immediately diminish me. "You really almost had us there for a second," Jada Jamal said, laughing nervously as he looked around at the guests to gauge their reactions. He shook his head and gestured toward me with extreme condescension. "For those of you who do not know, this is my older sister. She has a terrible habit of seeking attention. She runs a little party planning website back in Atlanta. She organizes balloons and table linens for local events." He walked closer, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of borrowed authority. "You do not own a $20 million estate, Jada. You do not own a global corporation. We rented this property through a highly exclusive luxury agency. You are absolutely delusional if you think anyone here believes your psychotic lies." Now stop embarrassing yourself and leave before William has his security detail throw you into the snow. Jamal shot a desperate seeking look at Ashley's parents, begging for their approval. William smirked, crossing his arms and nodding in agreement with my brother. Brenda let out a loud sigh of relief, visibly thankful that Jamal had stepped in to restore their fake reality. They were all so eager to believe his lie. They wanted the comfortable, familiar narrative where I was the pathetic, jealous failure and Jamal was the successful mastermind. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice or try to convince the room of my status. I simply looked at my brother, feeling a deep, profound pity for the hole he had dug for himself. I raised my right hand in the air and snapped my fingers once. The sharp sound cracked like a whip across the quiet room. Immediately, the heavy oak doors leading to the kitchen swung open. My primary estate manager, a brilliantly sharp woman who oversaw operations for this specific property, stepped out of the shadows. She was dressed in a pristine black suit, holding a silver tray. Resting on top of the tray was a sleek digital iPad. She bypassed everyone in the room, walking with absolute deference straight to my side. She handed me the tablet with a polite bow and stepped back, standing perfectly at attention behind my right shoulder. The entire room watched this flawless display of executive subordination in stunned silence. I unlocked the screen and swiped open the master property management file. I tapped the display, syncing my tablet directly to the massive smart television mounted above the roaring stone fireplace. The screen flared to life, illuminating the dark room with crisp, high-definition corporate documents. "Since you struggle with basic comprehension, Jamal, I will provide visual aids," I said, turning my gaze back to the crowd. I tapped the screen. The first document appeared on the massive display. It was the official notarized property deed for the Obsidian Chalet. There, printed in bold, undeniable black ink, was the legal ownership structure. It listed Apex Alpine Holdings as the sole proprietor. I swiped to the next slide, displaying the corporate registration documents from the state government. It clearly listed my full legal name as the founder, chief executive officer, and 100% majority shareholder of the corporation. The smug smile instantly vanished from Jamal's face. He stared at the giant screen, his eyes darting frantically across the legal text, searching for a loophole that did not exist. The guests began to murmur. William Kensington lowered his glass of scotch, his arrogant posture stiffening as the reality of the documents began to register in his mind. But I was not finished. The true execution had just begun. I swiped to the third and final slide. The screen shifted to display the highly secure billing profile for their specific weekend reservation. I zoomed in on the deposit ledger. "You told everyone you paid for this trip, Jamal?" I said, my voice echoing with lethal precision. "You told Ashley's family you handled the $50,000 security deposit to secure this estate. But we both know that is a lie. Because you do not have $50,000, you do not even have $50. I tapped the highlighted section of the screen, enlarging the image of the payment method. "You stole my corporate credit card out of my purse during Thanksgiving dinner," I stated, staring dead into his terrified eyes. "You committed federal wire fraud and identity theft to book a reservation through my own company. You thought you were scamming a faceless luxury agency. You had no idea you were renting my house with my stolen money." I pointed to the giant screen above the fireplace. The last 4 digits of the stolen card were displayed in bright red right next to the registered name on the account. My name. The color completely drained from Jamal's face. His skin turned a sickly pale shade of ash. His knees actually buckled slightly, forcing him to grab the edge of a dining chair to keep from collapsing onto the marble floor. The swagger, the fake billionaire persona, and the arrogant confidence evaporated into thin air. He was completely exposed, standing naked in front of the very people he had sacrificed his own sister to impress. I turned my attention away from my hyperventilating brother and locked eyes with the man who had threatened me just minutes prior. It was time to deal with William Kensington. I stepped away from the glowing screen and directed my full, undivided attention to William Kensington. Just moments ago, this man had stood before me with his chest puffed out, threatening to have his private security team drag me into the snow. He had looked down his nose at me, entirely convinced that his fabricated old money status made him a god among peasants. Now, watching the digital proof of my ownership glaring brightly above the fireplace, his arrogant posture had completely evaporated. The velvet blazer suddenly looked cheap. His shoulders were slumped, his face was glistening with a cold, nervous sweat, and the crystal glass of scotch trembled visibly in his hand. I walked slowly toward him, letting the sharp click of my stilettos dictate the heartbeat of the room. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, eager to distance themselves from the blast zone. "You were very quick to threaten me with your imaginary security detail, William," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and conversational. "You were incredibly eager to label me a trespasser and mock my background to protect your refined sensibilities. But since we are operating in the spirit of absolute transparency tonight, I think it is only fair that your family receives the exact same level of strict financial scrutiny you tried to weaponize against me." William opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. He looked at my father for help, but Calvin was staring at the floor, absolutely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own impending ruin. I turned my gaze to the wider audience, addressing the whispering guests, the shocked church friends, and the horrified extended relatives. When a reservation is booked at an Apex Alpine flagship property, we require a $50,000 security deposit to cover potential damages and high-end incidentals, I explained, projecting my voice so every single person could hear the exact mechanics of their destruction. My brother attempted to fulfill that rigorous requirement using a corporate black card he stole from my travel bag. However, because I reported that specific card compromised earlier today, the transaction immediately flagged for federal fraud in our system and locked the account entirely. I paused, letting my eyes sweep over Ashley, who was suddenly clutching her own arms, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. Now, our standard corporate protocol dictates that when a primary payment method fails, the concierge team must automatically run the secondary payment method held on file, I continued. I looked dead at Ashley's pompous parents, my smile hardening into something lethal. By the way, the stolen credit card Jamal used flagged for fraud and locked. So my staff ran the backup card Ashley's father put on file for the incidentals. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch across the grand dining hall. I wanted them to feel every single agonizing second of the suspense. It bounced twice, I said, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity. "Insufficient funds." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Ashley let out a sharp, choked noise, taking a sudden step away from her father as if poverty were contagious. William's face turned a violent, splotchy shade of crimson. He puffed his chest out again, desperate to salvage his crumbling dignity in front of the watching crowd. "There must be a massive banking error," William stammered, his voice loud and defensive. "My primary accounts are currently tied up in offshore investments. The international wire transfers often trigger automatic security freezes. My wealth manager will have this sorted out by morning." "How dare you publicly discuss my private finances over a simple administrative glitch?" "I did not just look into the payment failure," Williamus replied, cutting off his pathetic excuse with absolute crushing authority. "I run a global wealth management firm. When a guest attempts to secure a $20 million asset with a declined credit card, my risk assessment team performs a comprehensive background check. You do not have offshore investments. You do not have a wealth manager. You do not have a family trust fund. What you actually have is a failing regional distribution company, 3 maxed-out credit cards, and a second mortgage on a house that is currently listed for short sale." The illusion shattered completely. The grand, elegant facade they had spent months building was ripped away, exposing the pathetic, desperate reality underneath. I looked at Jamal, who was still gripping the dining chair for physical support, and then at Ashley, who was actively hyperventilating. I ruthlessly broke down the entire dynamic for the room to witness. "This entire engagement is a spectacular collision of 2 massive frauds," I announced. Ashley and her family thought they had found a wealthy, gullible black family to fund their luxury lifestyle and save them from bankruptcy. Jamal thought he had found a prestigious, old-money white family to elevate his social status, and fund his ridiculous tech startup. You are both actively trying to marry into wealth that simply does not exist. Ashley's parents are completely broke grifters, and Jamal is a 32-year-old unemployed thief who still begs his mother to pay his cellular bill. Ashley covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as her friends stared at her in shock. Jamal shook his head violently, looking like a cornered animal desperately searching for an exit that was not there. But the absolute worst part of this entire pathetic charade, I said, turning my focus directly to my parents, is how the two of you chose to finance your side of the illusion. Brenda took a staggering step backward. She raised a trembling hand, her eyes pleading with me to stop. "Jada, please," she whispered, her church lady respectability completely evaporating. "Do not do this. We are your family." "You stopped being my family the moment you told me I was too ghetto to attend this dinner," I replied coldly. I looked at the church friends who had praised my parents for their supposed wealth, watching their expressions turn to sheer horror. My parents did not pay for those first-class flights or those custom-tailored coats with their retirement savings. They afforded this trip by taking out a massive high-interest second mortgage on their house just 3 weeks ago. They literally risked foreclosure to buy their way into a broke family. Calvin finally found his voice. It was not his usual booming authoritative roar. It was a weak trembling sound. "That is our business, Jada," he said. "We did what we had to do to support our son." "You risked the very roof over your head," I shot back, my anger finally bleeding through my professional composure. "And the sickest irony of it all is that you do not even own that roof. 5 years ago, when Jamal bankrupted you for the second time, the county was preparing to auction your house off for unpaid property taxes. You cried in church and prayed for a miracle. I was that miracle. I set up an anonymous shell corporation. I paid your back taxes in full, and I have been quietly paying your property taxes every single year since then, so you would not end up sleeping on the street." My mother let out a loud, devastated wail, collapsing into a dining chair. My father stared at me, his eyes wide, completely paralyzed by the revelation that his entire life, his pride and his home, had been secretly sustained by the daughter he constantly diminished. "You are bleeding yourselves dry to fund Jamal's delusions," I stated, my voice echoing off the stone walls. "And you are silently relying on the daughter you despise to keep you from going homeless. You sacrificed your dignity, your morals, and your financial security to impress a man whose credit card declined for a plate of appetizers." The room was entirely decimated. There was no wealth here. There was no high society. There was no old money prestige. There was only a room full of desperate, lying people standing in a house they could never afford, staring at the one woman who actually held all the power. I stood supreme in the center of the wreckage, my tailored suit flawless, my expression completely unbothered. I had promised to burn their facade to the ground, and there was nothing left but ashes. The silence that followed my declaration was so absolute you could hear the crackle of the burning logs in the massive stone fireplace. For a fraction of a second, the room remained entirely frozen. Then the entire parasitic ecosystem collapsed in on itself with the spectacular violence of a dying star. Ashley turned on Jamal. The sweet, refined old money persona she had been projecting all evening completely evaporated, replaced by the shrill, frantic screeching of a cornered scam artist. Her face contorted with absolute rage as she shoved Jamal backward, hitting him squarely in the chest with both hands. "You told me you were a tech mogul," Ashley screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted wooden ceilings. "You told me you had millions in venture capital. You promised me a luxury lifestyle. You said this was your world. I am not marrying some broke, unemployed fraud who steals from his own sister." Jamal stumbled backward, his own panic morphing into vicious defensive fury. He pointed an accusatory finger right back at her face. "Do not you dare act like a victim," Jamal roared, completely abandoning his fake billionaire swagger. "You told me your father was an angel investor. You said your family trust was going to provide the seed money for my new application. I spent months putting up with your blatant disrespect and your parents' racist backhanded comments because you promised me funding. Your family is entirely broke. You are nothing but a massive liability. The mutual grift was finally exposed for everyone to see. They had been actively playing a high-stakes game of chicken, each secretly hoping the other would foot the bill for their delusions of grandeur. Ashley let out a guttural scream of frustration. She ripped the engagement ring off her finger, a ring my parents had likely financed with their disastrous second mortgage, and threw it directly at Jamal's face. It bounced off his cheek and skittered across the heated marble floor, disappearing under a table. While the bride and groom actively destroyed each other in the center of the room, my mother was experiencing a complete and total psychological breakdown. Brenda collapsed into a heavy oak dining chair, clutching her chest and hyperventilating. The precious, immaculate church lady respectability she valued above her own daughter was permanently destroyed. The wealthy congregation members she had flown out to impress were actively backing away from her. I watched as women who had been praising her just an hour ago began whispering furiously behind their hands. Several of them already had their phones out, texting the incredible scandal back to the rest of the congregation in Atlanta. Brenda's social currency, the only thing she truly cared about in this world, had hit absolute zero. My father, witnessing the complete annihilation of his legacy and his reputation, shifted into a state of sheer, unadulterated desperation. The authoritative, patriarchal deacon who had threatened to call the police on me just 15 minutes ago was gone. In his place was a terrified, bankrupt man. He abandoned his pride and rushed toward me, his hands raised in a pathetic, pleading gesture. "Jada, please!" Calvin begged, his voice cracking with panic. "You have to fix this. You have the money. You own this entire company. Just pay the catering bill. Clear the security deposit. We can sit down and talk through the property taxes tomorrow. Just do not embarrass us like this in front of the congregation. We are your family. You cannot just leave us standing here looking like fools. Protect your family's name." I looked at the man who had called me loud, ghetto, and ungodly simply because I existed without a husband. I looked at the man who had watched his son steal from me and applauded him for it. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, pristine sense of closure. "You ruined your own name, Dad," I replied, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. "You chose a fake aesthetic over your own flesh and blood. You financed your own destruction. I am not your savior anymore. I am simply the landlord." I turned away from his pleading face and signaled to DeAndre, who had been standing quietly at the perimeter of the room, flanked by 4 members of my private security detail. I raised my voice, ensuring it cut through the chaotic shouting match still raging between Jamal and Ashley. "Since the primary credit cards bounced, and since this is my private property, every single one of you is currently trespassing," I announced. The room instantly fell silent again, the sheer gravity of my words bringing their petty arguments to a grinding halt. "You have exactly 20 minutes to pack your bags and vacate my house. My security team will escort you to the curb. If you are not off the premises when that timer expires, the local Aspen police will remove you forcefully." William Kensington, his velvet blazer looking incredibly absurd as the reality of his eviction set in, puffed out his chest one last time. "You cannot throw us out into the freezing cold," he sputtered indignantly. "It is below freezing outside. We have nowhere to go. Our flights are not until Monday. I suggest you open your airline application and see if they accept bounced credit cards for early boarding fees," I replied smoothly. "Your 20 minutes started 30 seconds ago." I did not wait to hear another word. I turned my back on the wreckage of my family and walked gracefully toward the grand glass staircase. I climbed the steps with a light, effortless stride, leaving the chaos, the screaming, and the pathetic groveling firmly behind me on the ground floor. I entered my private penthouse suite, walked over to the minibar, and poured myself a fresh glass of chilled champagne. I stepped out onto the interior glass balcony, leaning against the railing to watch the final act of my masterpiece unfold. It was a logistical execution of sheer perfection. DeAndre and the security team moved with absolute corporate efficiency. They herded the frantic, protesting guests toward the coat check and the guest suites. There was no negotiation allowed. I watched from above as my mother sobbed hysterically trying to gather her expensive new cashmere coats while my father barked useless orders at no one in particular. Jamal was scrambling on his hands and knees under the dining tables, desperately searching for the discarded engagement ring, while Ashley and her parents shrieked at the security guards who were firmly directing them toward the heavy front doors. Because their booking had been officially flagged for financial fraud, my team had immediately canceled the fleet of armored black SUVs that had been scheduled to transport them. They were entirely on their own. I walked over to the exterior balcony doors and stepped out into the freezing mountain air. The heavy snowfall had started covering the driveway in a thick, pristine layer of white powder. The exterior floodlights illuminated the humiliating scene below. The massive mahogany front doors of the obsidian chalet opened, and the trespassers were pushed out into the bitter cold. I stood on my balcony, sipping my champagne, and watched the grand departure. I watched my parents, my golden child brother, and the racist broke in-laws drag their heavy luxury suitcases through the thick freezing snow. They slipped and stumbled in their expensive impractical leather shoes. The bitter wind whipped around them, completely ruining their perfectly curated high society aesthetic. The flashing red and blue lights of two local police cruisers reflected off the snowbanks at the bottom of the driveway, summoned by my security team to ensure the eviction was permanent and absolute. The officers stood by their vehicles, arms crossed, watching the group of frauds trudge down the long, winding path toward the main road. They had no cars. They had no money. They had absolutely nowhere to go. They looked small, pathetic, and entirely defeated against the massive, towering backdrop of the mountain I owned. I took a slow sip of my champagne, letting the crisp, cold bubbles wash down my throat. The champagne tasted like absolute victory. 6 months later, the view from the 40th floor of the Apex Alpine headquarters in downtown Atlanta was just as spectacular in the peak of summer as it had been during the dead of winter. The bright June sun reflected brilliantly off the surrounding glass skyscrapers, casting a warm golden glow across my polished mahogany desk. I sat back in my leather executive chair reviewing a finalized acquisition report for a new coastal property in Monaco. The numbers were flawless. The projections were entirely in the green. The dust from the avalanche I triggered in Aspen had completely settled, leaving behind a profound, untouchable peace in my life. The toxic noise that had plagued my existence for 35 years was finally and permanently silenced. It is truly remarkable how quickly a carefully constructed facade crumbles when the financial pillars supporting it are suddenly kicked away. My parents learned that harsh lesson in record time. Without my anonymous shell corporation stepping in to silently pay their property taxes, the devastating reality of their financial recklessness caught up with them almost immediately. The predatory second mortgage they had eagerly signed to fund their fraudulent high society performance was ruthless. The bank did not care about their esteemed church titles. The bank did not care about my mother's precious respectability politics. Within 4 months of the Aspen disaster, the bank foreclosed on my childhood home. They were unceremoniously evicted from the suburban fortress where they had spent decades judging everyone else. Brenda and Calvin now live in a cramped, outdated 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. There are no vaulted ceilings. There is no grand dining room to host their prestigious church friends. The physical manifestation of their pride is entirely gone, replaced by the stark, undeniable consequences of their own greed. The whispers in our megachurch congregation were utterly merciless. My mother, who had built her entire identity on being superior to the other women in the pews, suddenly found herself the subject of their vicious gossip. The same women she had spent decades looking down upon now offered her pitying smiles and handed her canned goods from the church pantry. They watched her downgrade from driving a luxury sedan. She could not afford to taking the public bus to Sunday service. Her social currency hit absolute zero, and she was forced to swallow the bitter reality that the elite world she desperately wanted to be part of had violently rejected her. As for my golden child brother, his spectacular downfall was the stuff of absolute legend. The moment they were escorted out of the obsidian chalet and dumped into the freezing Colorado snow, the mutual grift connecting him and Ashley completely disintegrated. With no stolen credit card to lean on and no wealthy sister to secretly subsidize his delusions, Jamal was exposed as nothing more than a 32-year-old man with empty pockets and a hollow resume. He had no actual skills, no real degree, and absolutely zero concept of hard work. The corporate world rejected him instantly, exposing the harsh truth that charm and a tailored suit cannot compensate for sheer incompetence. Ashley, realizing that the Williams family wealth was a complete fabrication, called off the wedding before they even boarded their commercial flight back to Atlanta. She returned to her broke, scamming parents, and Jamal was forced to move into that cramped two-bedroom apartment with our parents. The golden son was finally sleeping on a twin bed in a rented room, entirely stripped of the unearned arrogance he had paraded around for his entire life. I took my custom gold pen and signed the final page of the Monaco acquisition contract, enjoying the quiet, steady rhythm of my own success. Right as I closed the heavy leather portfolio, the private cell phone resting on the corner of my desk vibrated softly. The screen lit up, breaking the serene silence of my office. I glanced over at the notification banner. It was a text message from Calvin. Over the past 6 months, he and my mother had attempted to reach out through various channels, sending manipulative, passive-aggressive emails or leaving guilt-tripping voicemails. I had ignored every single one of them. But today the message was different. It was stripped of all the usual preaching and patriarchal authority. It was purely desperate. I picked up the device and opened the message thread. I read the words he had typed, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. "Jada, please," the message began. "We are 2 months behind on the rent for this apartment. Jamal cannot find a job, and your mother is struggling with her pride. We have nowhere else to turn. We need a loan just to keep a roof over our heads. Family is all we have. Please find it in your heart to help us." I stared at the glowing screen, letting the sheer, breathtaking audacity of his words sink in. Family is all we have. It was an incredible statement, coming from a man who had actively told me my single woman energy made me a liability. It was an astonishing plea from a father who had watched his son steal my corporate identity and applauded him for the hustle. When I was paying their property taxes and keeping them out of foreclosure, I was not considered valuable enough to attend their fake luxury celebration. I remembered a time years ago when my car broke down in the pouring rain across town. I had called my father for help, and he told me he was too busy detailing Jamal's new rims to come get me. He told me to download an application and find a ride myself. But now that the money was gone and the aesthetic was destroyed, suddenly, we were blood again. Suddenly, I was their last remaining hope. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not experience a fleeting moment of daughterly obligation. They had made their choices, and they had made them with extreme malice. They chose to finance their own destruction, and I was simply honoring their commitment to that choice. I tapped the reply bar at the bottom of the screen. I did not type a long explanation about financial boundaries. I did not remind him of the cruel insults he had hurled at me. I kept my response perfectly concise, echoing the exact same level of dismissive disrespect he had shown me when I needed him most. I typed 2 simple words. "Try Uber." I hit send. Then, without a second of hesitation, I tapped the settings icon in the top right corner of the profile and selected the option to block the caller. A confirmation prompt appeared on the screen, asking if I wanted to permanently prevent this contact from reaching me. I pressed confirm. The digital connection was severed instantly and completely. The final thread tying me to their toxicity was officially cut. I set the phone face down on the glass desk and stood up from my leather chair. I walked over to the sleek built-in wet bar tucked into the mahogany wall paneling of my office. I pulled a chilled bottle of vintage champagne from the refrigerator, popped the cork with a crisp, satisfying snap, and poured the golden liquid into a crystal flute. I walked back over to the floor to ceiling windows, looking out at the sprawling city I had conquered on my own terms. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the champagne, letting the cold, crisp bubbles wash over my tongue. You cannot buy class, but you can definitely buy the building they try to fake it in. The most powerful lesson from this story is that biological ties never excuse financial abuse or emotional manipulation. True power comes from recognizing your own worth and refusing to finance your own disrespect. When toxic family members continually try to diminish your success to elevate a completely false narrative, the best response is not arguing. It is permanently removing their access to your energy, personal space, and resources. You must bravely build your own empire rather than begging for a seat at a table that aggressively demands you shrink yourself. Always protect your peace. Please like, subscribe, and comment below.